As we begin our study of creative nonfiction, W203, I wanted to kind of explore some basic elements of creative nonfiction and how it differs from fiction and how it differs from straight-up journalism. So you can use some of these definitions and basic elements as you explore the course text and kind of rethink how the writer there has utilized these basic elements of craft. First of all, we can think about the history of literary journalism in context here. In the mid-20th century, writers started to kind of explore and develop this thing called literary journalism. It's different than straight-up journalism that you may be more familiar with from newspaper or online journalism, in that literary journalism uses fictional techniques such as plot and character to tell non-fictional stories here. So as opposed to retelling the story in the straight questions of who, what, where, when, and why of newspaper journalism, literary journalism explores the plot lines, explores the elements of character, and perhaps even kind of explores questions of point of view and objectivity and subjectivity within a story. So the essay there within literary journalism becomes a space of exploration as opposed to just simply chronicling history or events. There are four primary elements in which literary journalism established itself as an alternative to regular journalism, and we'll note each of these. The first is that the writer is immersed in the subject matter that he or she is writing about. So traditionally, the journalistic reporter tries to maintain a sense of objectivity, separate from the story. There is no I in a journalistic essay, but in a work of literary journalism, the reporter, him or herself, may be a part of the story. So as opposed to the objectivity that reporters traditionally demand, the literary journalist is allowed to be a part of the story. So it opens up the sense of subject matter, how one comes to know what one does or does not know in the end. For instance, a great writer like John McPhee, who wrote a whole book simply on the subject of oranges, made one of the points of his book the fact that he didn't know anything about oranges to start with. So how one comes to know the subject matter is a part of the literary journalist's work. Second, the narrative structure of the work of literary journalism versus the kind of traditional straight-up chronicle or history that journalism attempts to tell of the basic aspects of the events themselves and how they were connected. The writer of literary journalism can shape the story in some ways. So the literary journalist is free to tell the story chronologically, that is, in the order that it happened, or kind of can explore thematic parts of the story where the writer moves in and out of flashback or goes back and tells parts of the history that set context or leaves out parts of the history that may or may not set context. So the question of context becomes very important for the literary journalist as he or she explores the personal and cultural relationships that we have with stories being told. Number three is the question of accuracy and objectivity. As noted above, in traditional journalism, the reporter attempts to maintain a sense of distance from the story, a sense of objectivity. Within literary journalism, the line between fiction and nonfiction is a little bit blurred at times. John McPhee would say that the line between fiction and nonfiction is always negotiated in a constant contract with the reader. As the writer moves along, where things become on the borders of fiction become blurred in some ways. So what literary journalism attempts to do in some ways is to explore that I as a storyteller. How is a writer attached to the stories that he or she wants to tell? How is the reader attached to those similar stories? And how do you believe and understand your sense of what's truth there? In some ways, the figures who appear in a work of literary journalism become characters in a way. And you'll see this in the course text as the writer describes his family. How do the family members get constructed not as quote-unquote real figures, but as characters in the end. And the literary journalist is free to, as he or she writes the story, to reconstruct dialogue. You may not remember the exact conversation you had when you were 5 years old, but you can reconstruct it in some ways within a literary work of literary journalism. And then fourth and finally here, the literary journalist depends on the development of an authorial voice. So in traditional journalism, the reporter kind of has an institutional voice that speaks for the newspaper or for reportage in general. Here, the literary journalist is free to use an I that can move in and out of the story as an element of the story. And so it's kind of interesting how identity gets negotiated there within a work of literary journalism. How attached is the writer to the story? What are the things that draws him or her into the events that he or she's describing? A few things to note here in terms of literary journalism's relationship to fiction. We use the basic elements of storytelling in writing creative nonfiction. Things like character and plot and point of view, theme and setting. A couple are more important, particularly here. First is plot. So the plot within a journalistic story or personal essay and how it's constructed is a primary concern to the writer. How does the writer locate the story? That is, what is its central storyline? That is, some writers will speak of this as being a spine or a hook or a theme or a thread or a pull. What is it about the story? What are its central tensions that pull the reader through the story? What is the central storyline that draws the reader into and through the story? So you have to kind of sort out where your central storyline is versus the peripheral or side narratives that are there. The nice thing about this as a writer is that you can develop a sense of the beginnings and endings of stories here. That if you were going to tell your own story, your own kind of memoir, where would you locate the beginning? Would you locate it in your birth, in your first conscious memory, yesterday? Would you locate it in your parents' lives or your grandparents' lives? The writer of literary journalism is free to kind of set up where the beginning of a story is, as well as where its endings are. And in terms of literary journalism, for me in particular, this gives us a chance to explore history and our place within it. The writer Ralph Ellison often described what he called the great unwritten history of the Americas, the stories of people who were left out in terms of the larger histories. In what ways does a work like J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy also kind of try to claim a sense of that great unwritten history as it develops? How has Vance's story been left out? And perhaps later you could ask yourself, how has your own story been left out of that great history in a way? Think about the tensions in the plot here. You know, which works to tell your story? How do you sequence it? Or do you tell the story in order? Or do you tell the story out of order chronologically? What is memory's role in the plot? You know, what can you recall? How or why are those things important to the story's plot in the end? Maybe there's an element of obsession within recollecting those things. You know, how do you try to recall the details that are essential for retelling the story? And also here you can think about the questions of focus and digression. It is, how are you going to concentrate on particular certain central elements of the story, and in what ways do you give yourself room to digress on those? Think here about the dramatic aspects that introduced the tensions to the storytelling. So a few things here to note. Number one is the development of characters within the narrative. So rethink the people around the story. You know, they could be things like Barack Obama or Donald Trump, but they become characters as you tell your story within literary journalism. Here, the narrating I is a literary device that retells its autobiography. So if you get Barack Obama telling my story, or you get Donald Trump telling my story, in what ways does the I that they put on the page become a character in and of itself, as opposed to a real person? You can think about that I within the course text as well in those terms. Think about other characters here, their interactions and definition. You know, that if you were writing a piece of memoir and you wanted to describe your Aunt Trudy, what essential things about how she moves through the world would you need to include to tell her story or her part in your story. Think about the use of flashbacks and half scenes within your narration here. How do you rebuild those things through memory? A friend, Dan Rayburn, always says in regards to creative nonfiction is that it's kind of the opposite of fiction in some ways. That you need to tell your story, don't necessarily show it. Fiction tries to show its story instead of telling it. That the events of the story unwind through scenes and interactions. With creative nonfiction, sometimes you have to kind of go inside the character's world or inside the narrator's world and tell a bit of the story here. Excuse me. Think about the economy of the story, perhaps. What is it that is in short supply for the writer, and what is the writer willing to trade to have that thing? So what's in short supply, perhaps, in the course text, and what is the writer willing to bargain for to have that things? And then also, you can think about the boundaries that are present within a piece of creative nonfiction. The public and private spaces that the writer has, and how the writer moves in and out of those public and private spaces in defining him or herself. One of the boundaries here that is essential to that, of course, is that boundary between fiction and nonfiction. Where do you draw that line? Where does the writer in the course text draw that line? One of the things that we'll continue to come back to within the course. Thanks.